Three black SUVs turned onto Maple Hollow Road just after 4 in the afternoon, moving slower than any car had moved on that street in years. Mrs. Patterson stopped sweeping her porch. The Delgado boys froze mid-game, basketball rolling into the grass. An old man named Walter Higgins, who had not stood up from his lawn chair in 20 minutes, pushed himself to his feet just to see better. Nobody recognized the men inside those cars. Not yet. But one woman, watching from her kitchen window with a dish towel still in her hand, felt something cold move through her chest before she even understood why. 3 men stepped out. Tall, composed, dressed the way men dress when money has stopped being something they think about. The oldest one paused at the edge of the driveway he used to know better than his own heartbeat. And for a moment, he didn't move at all. He just looked at the house. Inside that house, a woman named Carol Whitfield hummed to herself while she peeled potatoes at the sink, completely unaware that the 3 boys she had once put out into the cold with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes were standing 50 feet from her front door. She had no idea why they had come back, whether it was to forgive her, to ruin her, or to finally say the thing none of them had ever been allowed to say. Before the sun went down that day, everything Carol Whitfield believed about her life was going to change. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Here is what nobody on Maple Hollow Road knew yet: who these 3 men really were. Why 3 teenage brothers had vanished from this town 8 years earlier without so much as a goodbye to a single neighbor. What kind of life takes a boy who slept in a church basement and turns him into someone who steps out of a car like that? And the hardest question of all, why, after everything that was done to them, they had chosen to come back at all. Stay with this story until the end, because the last conversation in that house is not the one you are expecting. To understand any of it, you have to go back to when their names were the only thing of value those boys had left. 15 years before those SUVs rolled down Maple Hollow Road, the Whitfield house was a different kind of loud. Not angry loud, just full. Full of 3 boys who couldn't sit still and a father who never seemed tired enough to stop chasing them around the yard. Marcus Whitfield was the oldest, 17, that final summer before everything changed. He had his late mother's quiet patience and his father's stubborn jaw, and from the time he was 12 years old, he had taken it as his job to watch over his younger brothers. Their mother, Diane, had died of a sudden heart condition when Marcus was 9, Jason was 6, and the baby of the family, little Tommy, was barely 2. Marcus didn't remember much about losing her except the smell of her hand lotion still on the pillows for months afterward, and the way his father, Robert, stopped singing in the kitchen. Robert Whitfield worked maintenance at the county school district, the kind of job that paid the bills and not much more. He raised 3 boys mostly alone for 6 years, and he did it without complaint, packing lunches at 5 in the morning and reading bedtime stories with his tie still half loosened from a long shift. Jason, 11 by the time this part of the story begins, was the thinker of the 3, always taking apart the toaster or the lawnmower just to see how the pieces fit. Tommy, only 7, followed his older brothers everywhere, certain that whatever they were doing was the most important thing happening in the world. They were not a wealthy family. The house on Maple Hollow Road had a roof that needed patching and a porch step that creaked in a way Robert kept promising to fix. But there was laughter in that kitchen most nights, and on Sundays Robert would make pancakes shaped badly like animals, and the boys would argue good-naturedly over whether his attempt at a dog looked more like a potato. Then, the summer Marcus turned 17, Robert met a woman named Carol at a community fundraiser for the school district. She was warm in public, generous with compliments. She brought casseroles to the house before she and Robert had even been dating 2 months, and she remembered each boy's favorite meal without being told twice. The town liked her immediately. Robert, who had spent 6 years being both mother and father to 3 boys, looked at Carol and saw relief. He saw someone who could finally share the weight he had been carrying alone. They married 8 months later in a small ceremony at the church on Route 9. Marcus stood beside his father as best man, 15 years old and trying to be happy for him, because his father deserved happiness, and because Carol had, so far, never given him a single reason not to trust her. That would not last. The change did not happen all at once. It happened in the way that water wears down stone, slowly enough that for a long time, nobody in the house could have pointed to the exact moment things shifted. It started small. Carol began serving dinner a few minutes after Robert left for his evening shifts at the school, and the boys noticed their plates were thinner than hers, smaller portions, less meat. When Marcus once asked if there was more, Carol smiled and said the grocery budget was tighter than people realized, though new clothes for her own visits to her sister kept appearing in her closet just fine. Jason's school project, a model bridge he had spent 3 weekends building for a science fair, was found crushed in the garbage one Tuesday morning. Carol said she had no idea how it happened. Jason never said another word about it, but Marcus noticed his younger brother stopped building things in the living room after that. He started doing it quietly in the garage instead, where no one would see. Tommy, the youngest, began wetting the bed again at 8 years old, something he hadn't done since he was 4. He wouldn't say why. It was Marcus who eventually found out, sitting with him one night after Tommy woke up shaking from a nightmare. Carol had taken to locking the boys out of the house for an hour or two after school if Robert wasn't home yet, telling them to play outside and get some fresh air. In winter, Tommy had started to associate the sound of the front door locking with something close to fear. Robert noticed none of it, not because he didn't love his sons, but because Carol made sure he never saw it. She was a different person entirely when his car pulled into the driveway. Warm, affectionate. The boys learned quickly that telling their father what happened during the day only led to Carol crying in front of him about how exhausting and ungrateful the boys had become, how hard she was trying, how unfair it was that they wouldn't give her a chance. "She's worried about you 3, Robert told Marcus one evening, sitting on the edge of his bed the way he used to when Marcus was small. "She says you've gotten distant since the wedding. Is something going on?" Marcus looked at his father, a man he loved more than almost anyone on earth, and made a decision that would haunt him for years afterward. He said no, nothing was going on, because the one time he had tried to explain what was actually happening, Carol had cried so convincingly that his father had looked at Marcus with something close to disappointment, and Marcus could not bear to see that look on his father's face again. So the brothers learned to handle it themselves. Marcus took the smaller portions without complaint and quietly gave half of his to Tommy. Jason stopped bringing projects home from school to avoid giving Carol something else to destroy. And all 3 of them learned the particular skill of making themselves small in their own house, of existing in the spaces Carol wasn't using. 2 years passed this way. Then, in the spring Marcus turned 19, Robert started getting tired in a way that wasn't about work. It began as exhaustion Robert attributed to long hours, then a cough that wouldn't clear. By the time he agreed to see a doctor, the diagnosis was a fast-moving cancer that had already spread further than anyone wanted to say out loud. He fought it for 4 months. Marcus remembers those months more clearly than almost anything else in his life, because for the first time since the wedding, Carol seemed to disappear from the house for long stretches, leaving the boys to actually care for their father themselves. Marcus, by then enrolled part-time at the community college and working nights at a hardware store, rearranged his entire schedule around hospital visits. Jason, 14 now, sat by his father's bed doing homework so Robert wouldn't be alone. Tommy, only 10, would climb carefully onto the hospital bed and just lie next to his father, not saying anything, just being there. In one of his last lucid weeks, Robert called Marcus into the room alone. "I need you to know something," he said, his voice thinner than Marcus had ever heard it. "I changed some things with the lawyer last year. About the house. About what happens after." He reached for Marcus's hand. "Whatever happens, you 3 are taken care of. That house is yours, your brother's. All of it. I made sure of it. Marcus didn't fully understand what his father meant by that conversation until much later. At the time, he simply held his father's hand and told him he wasn't going anywhere, even though both of them knew that wasn't true. Robert Whitfield died on a Tuesday morning in October, with Marcus, Jason, and Tommy at his bedside. Carol was at her sister's house an hour away and arrived 3 hours after he had already passed. The funeral was held that Saturday. 200 people came. Carol wore black and cried in a way that made the whole church reach for her, comforting her, telling her how strong she was being for those poor boys. Marcus stood at the front with his brothers, 18, 14, and 10 years old, and felt something in him go very quiet and very cold, though he could not yet have said why. He found out 3 weeks later, when a man he had never met knocked on the door holding a folder of paperwork and introduced himself as Carol's attorney. The paperwork said the house, the small savings account, and the truck in the driveway belonged entirely to Carol. Sole ownership. The attorney explained, not unkindly, that Robert had apparently signed updated account and property paperwork the year before, naming his wife as sole beneficiary, and that as a surviving spouse with no will on file naming the children directly, the law in their state defaulted everything to her. Marcus thought of his father's hand in his, the promise made in that hospital room. That house is yours, your brother's. He asked the attorney directly whether there was another will, a more recent one, anything filed elsewhere. The attorney said only the documents in front of him existed in any county record. 3 weeks after that conversation, on a cold evening in early November, Carol called all 3 boys into the living room. She told them, in a voice that had lost every trace of warmth it had ever performed for their father, that the house was hers now, that she had given them more than enough time to grieve, and that it was time for them to figure out their own lives. "You're 19, she told Marcus. "You're an adult. Take your brothers and go." Jason, 14, asked where they were supposed to go. Carol said that wasn't her problem anymore. Tommy, 10 years old, started to cry and asked the only question that mattered to him. "Are we going to see Dad's house again?" Marcus knelt down in front of his youngest brother, packed one duffel bag with whatever clothes the 3 of them could fit into it, and said the only true thing he had to offer. "We're going to be okay. As long as we're together, we're going to be okay." They walked out of the house that night with one bag between them and $43 Marcus had saved from his hardware store job. Behind them, the porch light Robert had never quite fixed flickered once before the door closed. If you're still watching up to now, type "I'm still here" in the comment section. I want to know who's making this journey with these 3 boys. The first night, they slept in Marcus's old Honda Civic in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner. The 3 of them folded into a car meant for 2 adults at most. Tommy cried himself to sleep against Jason's shoulder. Marcus stayed awake most of the night, doing math in his head that never worked out, no matter how many times he ran the numbers. For the first several weeks, they moved between the car, a church shelter 2 towns over that allowed families with minors for short stretches, and eventually a single room at a weekly motel that ate almost everything Marcus made working 2 jobs. He dropped out of community college without telling anyone, because tuition no longer existed in the same universe as rent and food for 3 people. Jason, despite everything, kept going to high school. He would do his homework under the fluorescent light of the motel bathroom, so he wouldn't wake Tommy, who had started sleeping curled against Marcus's side most nights, the way he used to sleep next to their father in the hospital. It was Tommy's elementary school counselor, a woman named Mrs. Alvarez, who first noticed something was wrong. Tommy had started falling asleep in class and showing up in the same clothes 3 days running. She pulled Marcus aside one afternoon when he came to pick his brother up, and instead of calling child services immediately, which she was required to consider, she asked him directly what was happening. Marcus, exhausted past the point of pride, told her the truth. Mrs. Alvarez didn't have money to give them, but she gave them something else. She knew a man named Earl Briggs who ran a small auto repair shop on the edge of town and had, years earlier, taken in a nephew going through something similar. She made one phone call. Earl Briggs was 64 years old, widowed, gruff in the way of men who had spent 4 decades with their hands and engines. He didn't offer charity. He offered work. He told Marcus he could sweep floors and learn the trade in exchange for a fair wage and the use of a small apartment above the shop that had been sitting empty since his nephew moved out. It wasn't large. It had 1 bedroom and a pull-out couch. But it had a working heater and a door that locked from the inside, which Tommy noticed immediately and never stopped being grateful for. "You don't owe me your life story," Earl told Marcus the first week. "You owe me honest work and you keep those boys in school. That's the whole deal." The years that followed were not a montage of overnight success. They were slow, and they were hard, and there were nights Marcus genuinely did not know if the apartment heat bill would get paid. Marcus worked for Earl by day and took night classes in business administration, paid for 1 slow semester at a time. Jason, who had always been the one taking apart toasters, discovered an old computer Earl kept in the back office and taught himself to code from library books and free online tutorials, sometimes staying after closing just to use the shop's internet connection. Tommy, the baby of the family who used to follow his brothers everywhere, grew into a teenager obsessed with how things were built, spending his weekends helping Earl with anything mechanical and reading library books about engineering that were technically meant for college students. There were real failures along the way. Marcus's first attempt at starting a small delivery service for local shops folded within 8 months when his only truck broke down beyond repair. Jason built a piece of scheduling software for local businesses that 2 clients used before quietly switching back to pen and paper. Tommy, still in high school, spent a year designing a small wind turbine for a science competition that placed dead last. None of them quit. Marcus took what he learned from the failed delivery service and, 3 years later, built a leaner logistics company that solved one specific problem better than anyone else in the region, helping small manufacturers get goods to retailers faster and cheaper than the big national carriers could. It grew slowly, then quickly, then it grew in a way that surprised even him. Jason kept coding through 2 more failed products before his third idea, a piece of financial software that helped small businesses manage cash flow without an accountant, found the right moment and the right market. Tommy went on to study mechanical engineering on a partial scholarship Mrs. Alvarez had helped him apply for, and years later started a company focused on affordable solar installation for working-class neighborhoods, the kind of neighborhoods he remembered living in. By the time Marcus turned 31, 8 years after the night they walked out of the house on Maple Hollow Road with 1 duffel bag and $43, all 3 brothers' companies were worth, combined, well over $1 billion. They never once forgot Earl Briggs. They never once forgot Mrs. Alvarez. And they never once stopped wondering about the house they grew up in and the woman still living inside it. It was Jason, the brother who had always paid attention to details others missed, who found it. While setting up a trust for his own young daughter, Jason's estate attorney ran a standard records search across old county filings, the kind of routine check that turns up nothing 99 times out of 100. This was the 100th time. Buried in a digitized batch of decade-old county documents was a will, filed by Robert Whitfield 11 months before his death, that had never been entered into the active probate record due to a clerical filing error during a software transition the county had undergone that same year. The will named all 3 of his sons as equal heirs to the house and remaining assets. It made no mention of sole ownership passing to Carol. Jason called Marcus before he had even finished reading the full document. "Dad never changed his mind," he said, his voice unsteady in a way Marcus hadn't heard since they were boys. "It was never about us. The paperwork just got lost in some county system, and nobody ever went back to check." The brothers spent the next several months working quietly with attorneys, not to seek revenge, but to understand exactly what had happened and what, if anything, was legally still theirs to claim. What they learned reframed everything. Their father had not chosen Carol over them in some final act of betrayal. A clerical error, compounded by Carol's own quick legal filing right after his death, claiming sole spousal ownership before anyone thought to check for a more recent will, had erased their father's actual wishes from the official record entirely. Meanwhile, separate from anything the brothers were doing, Carol's own life had been unraveling for years. The house had 2 mortgages against it she had taken out and never fully disclosed to anyone. A string of bad investments, made on the advice of a boyfriend who left town not long after the money did, had drained whatever savings remained. Neighbors who once admired her at the funeral now crossed the street to avoid a conversation about money she clearly didn't have to repay them. The brothers made their decision together, sitting in Marcus's office on a Sunday afternoon, the same way they used to make decisions huddled in the back of an old Honda Civic. They would go back to Maple Hollow Road, not with lawyers leading the way, not with anger as the plan, with the truth and with whatever came after it. Carol Whitfield was peeling potatoes at her kitchen sink when she heard the cars stop outside. By the time she walked to the front window and saw 3 black SUVs and 3 grown men standing in her driveway, recognition arrived slowly. Then all at once, the way cold water finds every part of you before you can move away from it. She opened the door before they reached the porch steps, one hand pressed flat against her chest. Marcus. Her voice cracked on the single syllable. Jason. Tommy. She said each name like she was confirming something she didn't want to be true. Marcus stood at the bottom of the steps, 31 years old now. Nothing like the 19-year-old who had carried a duffel bag down this same driveway. We need to talk, Carol. About Dad's will. Her face changed at the word will, a flicker of something Marcus recognized immediately, because he had seen that exact look on her face years earlier, the night she told 3 grieving boys to figure out their own lives. They sat in the living room that still had the same couch from when their father was alive, though it had gone threadbare with age. Marcus laid out the documents calmly. The original filing, the clerical error, the will their father had actually intended to be honored. He did not raise his voice once. Carol's hands shook as she looked through the pages. I didn't know, she said quietly. When the lawyer told me everything was mine, I believed him. I didn't go looking for another will. I just believed what I was told. Maybe, Marcus said. But you didn't have to lock a 10-year-old out of the house in winter either. Nobody's attorney told you to do that. Carol said nothing. There was nothing left to say to that, and she seemed to know it. It was Tommy, 23 now, and the one she had once made cry the hardest, who spoke next. We're not here to take your home, Carol. We talked about it for a long time before we came. Dad would not have wanted us to put you out on the street, even after everything. Jason explained what they had decided. The house would legally transfer to the 3 of them, as their fathers were required. But they were prepared to let Carol remain in it, rent-free, for as long as she needed, while she got back on her feet. They would not pursue any legal claim for the years of assets she had already spent. They asked for only one thing in return, something money could not buy and lawyers could not write into any agreement. We just want you to say it, Marcus said, out loud. What you did to us. Not to a lawyer. Not to the church. To us. Carol Whitfield, 61 years old, sat in her living room across from the 3 boys she had once thrown out into the cold, and for the first time in 14 years, she did not perform an emotion for an audience. She simply cried, and through it, she said the thing she had never once said, that she had been cruel to them, that grief and her own fear of being left with nothing had made her into someone she did not recognize anymore, that she knew no apology could give them back the childhood she had taken pieces of. It did not erase 14 years. Marcus has said since that it was never going to. But it was, he says, enough to let all 3 brothers leave that house for the second time in their lives feeling lighter than when they walked in. The brothers did not return to Maple Hollow Road to punish anyone. They returned because Jason found an old document in a dusty county file, because their father's true wishes had simply been waiting 8 years for someone to look hard enough to find them, and because three grown men finally had the standing and the safety to ask one woman to account for what she had done. Today, Marcus runs his logistics company from a city 2 states away, employing close to 400 people. Jason's software is used by small business owners who remind him, every time he sits in on a customer call, of the family that once had nothing. Tommy's solar company has installed panels in over a dozen working-class neighborhoods almost identical to the one above Earl Briggs's repair shop, where three brothers once shared a pull-out couch. Earl Briggs, now in his 80s, still owns that repair shop. The brothers quietly paid it off in full years ago, without telling him until after the fact. Mrs. Alvarez retired from school counseling, and the three of them fund a scholarship in her name for kids in foster care and unstable housing situations who want to go to college. As for Carol, she still lives in the house on Maple Hollow Road. Neighbors say she keeps mostly to herself now. The brothers visit twice a year, not out of warmth exactly, but out of something closer to peace, the kind that comes from finally understanding a story all the way through instead of carrying around only the worst chapter of it. If you were one of these three brothers, would you have let Carol stay in that house? Would you have forgiven her at all, or walked away the moment you had the truth and the means to leave for good? Have you ever discovered, years later, that the worst thing that happened to you was never actually your father's choice, but something far smaller and far stupider? A filing error, a missed envelope, a piece of paper nobody checked? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. In our next story, a woman cleaning houses for a living gives her last $20 to a stranger sitting outside a gas station, not knowing that by the next morning, that same man would walk into the company she cleans for and sit down behind the desk of its new owner. You will not want to miss that one. If this story moved you even a little, do us a favor. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Share it with someone who needs to hear that the worst chapter of your life is very rarely the final one. A filing cabinet in a county basement held the truth for 8 years. Nobody came looking for it, until three brothers finally had nothing left to be afraid of.